Barbara, what are the types of tools of how you help your clients so that they don't have to become you in order to find success?
Yeah, so we replicate basic employer provided benefits. So you don't have PTO, we're going to set up PTO. How are we going to do that? We are going to look for trends for where there's big influxes of cash. Let's say you're an industry professional and the holiday season's coming around. November, December, you're going to be pulling an extra grand. Let's use that $1,000 of excess income and bucket for our PTO for the next year. Let's take 10 envelopes, put $100 earmark it for 10 days off that you can take next year. So we're just going to start to replicate those systems and understand that some of this is just mental shifts. When it comes to investing, I always like to say investing is like wine in that you can get really into the weeds. You can talk about Forex, you can talk about crypto, you can talk about bell curves and PE ratios. You can get so into the weeds with investing, but you don't have to get that into the weeds in order to have a great investing career. Simplicity is key here. Financial services does a disservice to a lot of the public by overcomplicating a lot of these concepts with jargon, and it's their way of gatekeeping. I think it's important to remind people that a lot of these concepts can be broken down very simply if somebody wants to break them down simply.
Welcome to the Spear and Clover podcast, the show where military mindset meets the spirit of the puppy. I'm your host, Jason Skisick, the entrepreneurial evangelist, and each week I bring you the stories of visionaries who see the world as it could be and can't help but take action. One of the best pieces of advice I know for young people is to spend at least some time in a service job. Things like waiting tables, bartending, washing cars, etc. The reason this is so valuable is it teaches you about hustle, it teaches you about real teamwork, and most importantly, customer service. And these are things that'll last you for your entire life. And that's why I always recommend that everybody should spend at least some time in one of these service roles. But for millions of Americans, these jobs give them the ability to make a decent living while retaining a flexible lifestyle. This means that they're heavily reliant on cash tips to succeed. And it's always been very difficult for these folks to save up meaningful wealth and resources on par with their 9-to-5 counterparts. Today's guest wants to change all of that. Barbara Sloan noticed that for years, she was seeing personal finance tips and education that only focused on the more traditional 9-to-5 careers and left these tip-dependent workers out in the cold. So she's built a coaching business and even wrote a book called Tipped that delivers real and useful education on how to build wealth and live a high-quality lifestyle when working in a tip-centric service career. This is a conversation that I've been looking to for weeks and one that I'm sure you won't want to miss. Please welcome my friend, Barbara Sloan. Barbara, how are you?
Jason, I'm so good. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so excited to chat.
Yeah, this is going to be great. So for the listeners at home, you've chosen to focus on this tip-centric service industry. Tell us why. Where are you coming from, and how did you notice that this would be a problem, and what made you decide to pick it up as your lifestyle or your living?
Yeah. So most people who meet me today know me as somebody who owns a women-owned and operated high-end construction company in the heart of Manhattan. But what they don't know is that I spent 20 years working two career paths in tandem. And that was working service industry jobs at night and construction jobs in the day, or as I like to say, dirt in the day and dirty in the evening.
Sure.
And so I would say one of the big punctuation moments for me was in 2013. My wife and I moved to New York City with like $700 in our pocket, and I got two jobs. The first job I got was working nights at a bar called Coyote Ugly. I don't know if people know it, but it's a bar where you beat your patrons, you get girls to take their bras off. It's a spicy good time.
Yeah.
And then I got a job working days on Wall Street in an unregulated market. And this was new for me. This was like, my first entry into financial services. And I got a huge education on the markets, predatory lending, financial services, kind of the ugly side of financial services. And I lasted about 6 months before our third trader got shipped off to rehab. And I was like, oh my God, this is so toxic. I need to go back to construction and bars because this is terrible. But it was that sort of like opening moment for me of kind of understanding, oh, this is how a debt cycle is created. This is how people get pushed behind the starting line. And so that was a little bit of an aha moment. But then I left that job and I got a job at a construction company where I was employee number 4. This is actually the company that I now own. And I was afforded the opportunity to create an HR department and also run the financials and accounting side of the business. And I had never had HR before, so I had no idea what I was doing. So I was researching, what does HR do?
Yeah.
What is a 401k? What is a paid time off policy?
Yeah.
How does HR help the financial well-being of employee? And it was in seeing those systems and benefits. And then also we were working for these really high-end and high net worth clients. And I was getting to have conversations with them on a daily basis about their budgets and how they made trade-offs with their money and just sort of that mindset side of things. And it was seeing the systems and the mindset and realizing, oh my God, this is the reason that me and my peers have been left out of wealth building. And I need to do something about it.
Gosh, I think that's so interesting. I have a million questions, some of which aren't necessarily going to take us where we're trying to go in the call. You mentioned a phrase that I want you to unpack just for the listener at home who maybe heard it skate over and didn't understand it. When you talk about a debt cycle, what do you mean by that?
So for most people, when you get into debt, it's really hard to get out of debt because you're throwing every extra amount of money that you receive at the debt. And so if you don't have any savings to tackle that next, oops, life happens, life is lumpy, things happen, things get in the way, then what happens is once you pay off that debt, you're going to go right back into debt. So that's what's known as a debt cycle. It's very common for people, once they get into debt, to stay in debt. And my biggest piece of advice is always, yes, you should focus on debt, but debt is just the thing you hold. And you can hold a lot of things at once. You are not in debt, you have debt. The language there is so important for people with identity. So if you start in debt, the most important thing you can do is build up a savings buffer so that you can slowly pay down that debt, but you also have this cash savings, which prevents you from getting deeper in debt and continuing that debt cycle.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking to me deeply because I remember being 20 years old before I ever went into the military, before I kind of got my stuff together. And I remember you hear this said, but I lived it, where like a traffic ticket can turn into ruining your life. And I'll just talk it through. It's like you get a traffic ticket, you don't have enough money to pay it. So then they suspend your license. Now you can't get to work anymore. And so you drive your car. This is something that happened to me 3 different times as a young man, which was terrible because I was not being smart. But, and then if they catch you, now you're arrested. Now you have to get a lawyer. You've been arrested because you're driving on a suspended license. This happens to people. And there's
you have to take days off. You have to go to court. You have to, I mean, I part of the reason that I was so passionate about delivering this message is that I have screwed up so much. I feel like I have truly tested the limits of the credit system. I didn't know that your library could hit your credit report. It can. I learned that the hard way. I didn't know medical debt from other countries could hit your credit report. It can. I know that. Right? Like I was the person using Rent-A-Center to get a TV and a couch whenever I moved. Like I have failed so hard and so many times with this system. And so I, like you, I truly feel this in the depths of my bones.
I can tell. And I just love how engaged with it you are and how clearly you understand it from so many different angles. I want to dial down into the tip-based service folks. But before we do, just broadly, working with these investor type folks who are clearly using debt towards their own ends. Can you talk about just some of the high level differences that you noticed between those folks who are doing it very well and successfully and sort of your average person who ends up caught underneath the tide of this, vicious debt cycle? So what were some of the differences you pulled out just generally?
Yeah, I mean, it was a small portion of their overall net worth, right? Like there was a different level of ratio. I think that was what was eye-opening, and also seeing the fact that they kept it proportional. So when you're seeing these really wealthy people purchasing these high-end properties, you're seeing it make sense, right? They're having conversations with their brokers and their architects and their designers. They're not just buying the most expensive piece of slab marble. They're saying like, okay, what's the value that this can potentially have? And we're going to stay within that range. It's got to make sense. And so they're not making these decisions from a purely wasteful, I have this money and I can just spend it because I have it. It's tied into a larger picture.
Yeah. And I'd be willing to bet that the debt that they're taking on is buying assets that will create more wealth. Whereas so many of us at that lower tier, however you would say that socioeconomically, are taking on debt to buy things that are just losing value, things like cars and sometimes even houses.
Yeah, or they're using what
Yeah.
they've generated from those
Yeah.
assets to buy these things
Right.
already, right?
Right.
Like the investment has already been made. And so yeah, it was seeing those types of things. And then even just those trade-offs. Like people aren't just I remember thinking that being wealthy just meant you were rich. Like it just had no
Yeah.
concept for me. And now I understand that it means you have control. You have control over your finances. You have control over your choices. That's what being wealthy means. That's what
Yeah.
being rich means. And so it was understanding that was a big mindset shift.
Yeah. And it's such a perceptive thing for you to have picked up, especially considering you weren't even already focused on that. You were focused on the contract, the construction, and you were focused on learning HR and all these other things. So, shout out to you, Barbara, super dynamic and creative. So now let's shift a little bit to the service folks. So talk to me about what it really is like in 2023 for some folks that are driving in their car now, listening to this. Maybe they worked at the McDonald's when they were young. Maybe they worked at the TGI Fridays. That was me. Maybe they worked at the car wash, also me. But they may not understand what is it like today for someone who is heavily reliant on tips. Who are these people? There's even sectors that didn't exist when we were young. Who are these people, and what is their life like now?
Yeah, when I started, you touched on something really important when you started the segment, which was just that everyone should work in this industry. And why
Mm-hmm.
is that important? Because the reason I'm so successful in business is that everything that I needed to know to run a multi-million dollar company, I learned working in the service industry.
Yeah.
I learned how to navigate problems and navigate people and utilize them as a resource while I was working behind a bar, waiting tables,
Mm.
dancing at clubs. I learned how to manage all of these resources. I understood how to do quick back of the envelope math. I was like, all right, if I got 6 tables, I'm going to turn, you were doing that constant back of the envelope math throughout your shift. You
Mm-hmm.
understand how to have time management. You get into a flow state. You understand quality control, right? You are navigating so many of the basic pillars of entrepreneurship during just a regular shift that this is an industry that has skills that translate to almost any industry.
Mm-hmm.
However, when I was doing research for my book and I started to dig into the numbers of these people, I was shocked because service industry professionals age into the most economically disadvantaged population in our country. The majority of currently retired service industry professionals rely solely on Social Security.
Mm.
And when you understand that in 2020, the average Social Security check was less than $20,000, and that's for people who claim their income in full. And then you also understand that people in this industry are not claiming their income in full because they're not tracking their income. You
Mm-hmm.
can start to understand that there is a very real problem systemically within this industry.
I couldn't agree more, but I want to widen the gap for the listener at home. And so it's easy to think I'm an accountant, I'm a lawyer, I'm an entrepreneur. I make 100, 150, $200,000 a year. Yes, waitresses, servers, bartenders, barbacks, all of these folks. Well, they make so much less. But I think you and I both know. Talk to me about apples to apples. Talk to me about a service professional and a 401k having 9 to 5er that both are making the same amount of money, 80, 90, $100,000, whatever that number would be today. How are their two lives different? And what are the traps that they're falling into?
Such a good question. I'm going to back it up even more.
Yeah.
So, when we're talking about service industry professionals, we are talking about more than 5.5 million people working in the
Hmm.
second largest employment sector in the United States. When we are talking about service industry professionals, we are typically talking about three different buckets of work. The first is that bar, restaurant, club, hospitality side of work,
Mm-hmm.
right? The second is like those beauty and body services, your tattoo artist, your massage parlor, anyone who's handling the eyelash extensions, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then you have the third bucket, which is like transportation services, your valet, your movers, the people who are carrying your piano, your, delivery drivers, all of those transportation and delivery type services. I primarily focus on that first category of people, those waitresses, bartenders, dancers. And the reason I do that is because those people are subject to an entirely different minimum wage than the rest of the country. It's called a sub minimum wage. It's a tipped sub minimum wage, which federally is $2.13 an hour.
Still, that's crazy.
Still,
Yeah.
which is insane. I can't even that's $1.40 less than a gallon of milk today. Like it's laughable. And we have seen 7 increases in the standard minimum wage, which is still $7.25. And that's still a hard wage to live on, right? But we've seen that increase 7 times, whereas the tip minimum wage has not. And so that's just like one piece of the financial puzzle when we're talking about that tipped minimum wage. The other things that are different between, our tipped worker and our 9-to-5 person is when a tipped person goes to a bar and a 9-to-5 person goes to the bar, we'll call him Jason, our 9-to-5 worker, right? He is dealing with net numbers.
Yeah.
Our tipped worker is dealing with gross numbers. Our Jason worker already has his taxes deducted, his paid time off, his health insurance, which he's like saving an additional $15,000 because it's a pre-tax benefit, right? There's just so many layers within that structure that help a person get ahead. Our tipped workers don't have any of those financial safety nets. They don't have access to health insurance. They don't have access to a paid time off policy. Even in a state where paid time off is required, cash flow wise, you will not see a paid time off. So if you're in a state, you're like, oh no, they get paid days off. My state mandates it. Okay, first we're talking $2.13 an hour that they're going to be paid for 8 hours, which is $17. Secondly, there's forced tip claiming, which means that that's eaten completely in taxes. So cash flow wise, you never get a day off. You don't see those tips. You aren't able to schedule a day off. So from paid time off, health insurance, no access to 401k, no HR. HR is a huge resource for people in wealth building. Majority of Americans build wealth in 2 ways. The first way that they build wealth is through their 401k. How that happens is because Sharon, our hero from HR, she's like, Jason, check this box on this form. She has the greatest tool at her resource, which is automation. And that is how majority of Americans build wealth. And you get to retirement and you're like, woohoo, I have $800,000. Whereas our tipped workers maybe have 8. Right? Because they didn't have Sharon from HR helping them with automation, saying, just check this box. Everyone does it. It's 10% in the bucket. You'll thank me later. Right? They don't have that. And they don't have HR. And it's not, I'm here for the employees, but the employers are not these evil, overlords who are just out to ruin their employees' lives. These are small mom and pop shops. Over 90% of service industry establishments are ran by mom and pop shops. They don't have the resources to have something like an HR professional to manage the compliance of a 401k or an FSA or any of the other employer provided benefits. And yet this industry provides so many intangible assets to our communities and our economy. If you think about the second way that people build wealth in America, the second biggest way people build wealth, it's real estate, right? Real estate is propped up based on these service establishments, right? When you think about, oh, I'm going to buy a house, what's the first thing you think about? You think about what's around here, what restaurants, what bars, what services can I get? So this industry props up our real estate industry and also at the same time excludes those workers from being a part of it because one, they don't have that and that education to know that they're required to claim their tips in order to have a high enough income to not be part of that predatory lending part of financial services that we were talking about earlier. So those are just some of the ways that the financial lives are different for people in the tipped world versus in the 9-to-5 world.
Let me tell you why I love your mission. Because when I'm listening to you talk about this, aside from the fact that you're totally animated and completely, supremely educated on this, like your analysis here is just spot on. And the way you can tell that is I'm not an expert in this, and everything you're saying sounds perfectly accurate and correct and right and how it should. But why I love your mission is what I can boil down what you just said to is it's behavior changes. It's learning, it's education and behavior changes that are almost 100% of at least the current solution. And we'll talk about other ideas down the road. And so to me, what that means is if you're listening to this, or you're listening to this and you know someone who is trying to build a career in a service tipped based industry, they're not hopeless. They're not alone. And there is someone who can show them, hey, apples to apples, you can have the same amount of money at the end of your career as that person who has the cushy job. And you still get to retain your flexibility, and you don't have to go get an MBA, and you don't have to do all of these things. And so I just love, love, love when someone comes to market with with a solution to a problem that's very close, in my opinion, to complete. And so I just love that so much. Where do you think that this industry should go from like legal or system perspective that would maybe make it better for these folks that we rely on in every single way? I don't know if you mentioned the delivery drivers, but that's something that has arisen since we were young, and that's newer, the Uber Eats and the Grubhub and stuff, but this is a massive sector. And so where does this go from a system perspective that you could see maybe more, and I don't always use the word equitable, but like equitable way to pay these folks?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I have a policy wish list, right? Like, I mean, the
Yeah.
first thing, and one of my biggest one, is to do away with that sub minimum wage. Everyone is entitled to a living wage, regardless of how they earn money.
Mm-hmm.
But tipping is not going to go anywhere. Like, I often see in the forums, people be like, oh, well, pay your employees more. And it's like, no, the government has this arrangement. Tipping has been around for hundreds of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Over 100 years in the US. And the government allows this system because this industry provides so many intangible resources. And they're like, hey, we will allow the consumer to directly subsidize the workers' wages because we understand that this is an industry that has such a slim margin of success and it's hard to operate. And we know that it does so much for our communities and our economy. So
Mm-hmm.
the most important thing that we as consumers or individuals can do is be conscientious of this industry and understand how to tip, right? You have to be an engaged consumer in any industry, right? You want to get healthcare in our country, you have to be educated and engaged to get the services that you need. Being in the service industry, being engaged consumer in the service industry, the first thing you need to understand is that it's only surrounding luxury services. So you're not going to find tipping at a hospital. You're not going to find tipping at a grocery store or anywhere that there's a basic human need. You're
Mm-hmm.
going to find it in luxury services. And so if you are new to getting to a level of wealth where you're starting to engage in
Yeah.
luxury services, congratulations, that's awesome. But you have to educate yourself on this industry and understand how to operate so that you can be a good steward in that industry and tip appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
So I often like to talk about like how we can have that personal accountability, right? Like, I don't have connections to politicians. I can't make policy changes.
You
What I
will
can,
soon.
but what I can tell people is like, this is how you can control what you can control. So if you want to help this industry and you're a 9 to 5er, tip well, understand that this is a very different industry than likely the industry that you're in, and know how
Mm.
to operate within it, right? You can still speak up if something goes wrong. You can still, express dissatisfaction. You can still be frustrated when everyone's flipping around these iPads asking for a tip in places where you felt like you didn't have to tip before. All of those things are okay,
Mm.
right? The world is changing, and it's important to be part of that conversation. But tipping is very important for the livelihood of the people in this industry. And
Yeah.
it's not solved by employers paying higher wages. It will help. It will be a big part of helping these people build
Mm-hmm.
wealth,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not the only solution. So I have a huge wish list, but the reason I wrote this book was because what you were talking about with like giving individuals hope that
Yeah.
this industry doesn't typically have an income problem. It's not a high income industry, but it's not an income problem industry.
Mm-hmm.
It's a management and systems problem that we have in this industry. There's so many things I love about this industry. There's so much opportunity. There's no cap to how much you can earn,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is one of the only industries where you can work more to earn more. It's
Mm-hmm.
one of those industries that can help you move between social classes.
Oh yeah.
And it has so many, I like to say opportunities within it, the networking opportunities that you can have within it, the engagement with people. It's very fun, but there are also hazards to the industry as well, right? And so it's just about being aware of those two things. In the financial world of influencers and educators and services, we all love to talk about that $40,000 a year janitor who retired with $8 million in his bank account. And I
Yeah.
love that example because it shows you what's possible. And when you see what's possible, then you know that you can mirror some of those things. And so that speaks to that hope of like, when you are a low or middle income earner, you aren't trying to replicate a retirement account of a six-figure earner because that's not your lifestyle. It is just as possible for you to invest and have a successful or early retirement and a successful career on a low and middle income salary. And that's part of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. I want to linger on this idea of the differences, though, because this is such an interesting topic to me, and I hope it's interesting to our listeners and you. But now let's compare something else. So, as an entrepreneur, I deal with a lot of contractors. These are folks that I pay a decent amount of money to, and certainly from painters and carpenters all the way up to consultants and marketing agencies, right? You get these contractors that you don't have to have 401ks and all this other stuff. And a lot of those folks struggle as well. Are they facing similar constraints, dollar for dollar in lockstep with each other? Like, are they facing similar constraints, and how are those two different between a tipped person who's making $100,000 a year and, let's say, a painter who does 1099? Because this person, what is the difference there? I don't know if there's anything even to comment on there, and I'll cut this out if it's not useful. But
no, honestly, this is such a great question because part of what I tell people when they come in for my coaching practice is that it's harder for you. Let's just be honest about the fact that money management is going to be harder for you, whether you're a service industry professional or you're a 1099 contractor, because in essence, you are an employer, right? You have to manage your business just like any other business. I'm very lucky to be married to somebody who does corporate financial planning and analysis for a top Fortune 500 company. She just took her company public 2 years ago.
Wow.
And we have these conversations all of the time. I'm like, what do you do for budgeting? It is the same thing that I tell my clients to do for budgeting. Look for trends, set targets, look back and see if your guesses were right and adjust. Whether you're a company earning millions of dollars or you're an individual on a fluctuating income, getting to 1099 and all of the swings that involves with your income, you have to be diligent in tracking, in making guesses, and in managing your finances. And it's hard because no business ever has the same 2 months of income. You're an entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur. I run a business. I've never had 2 months in a row where I make the same amount of money. It's never happened. And that's the same for gig workers and service industry professionals. And so my two favorite chapters in my book, one is the budgeting chapter because it is so robust. And the fact that like everyone in the personal finance space is telling you budget based off of your income. That doesn't work for us. We have to budget based off of our expenses. Why? Because our expenses are more fixed than our income. So 99% of all of the personal finance advice that tells you how to budget is garbage for people in the service industry professionals and in the gig economy and those 1099 contractors. You have to manage your money in a completely different way. My second favorite chapter in my book is the investing chapter because it's so complicated when you don't have somebody to walk you through how to set up retirement for yourself, how to invest, right? I mean, think about when you're 9 to 5 Jason and you have Sharon from HR and she's like, here, we have these two options, pick one, right? It's easy. But when you're on your own out there and you're trying to navigate all of these options, it's overwhelming. It's paralyzing. And so, yeah, there's not a ton of difference between the service industry professional financially and the 1099 contractor financially. The hazards are different in different industries, right? In the service industry, the reason that you're going to have an emergency fund is going to be very different than why a contractor is going to have an emergency fund, right? When you're in the service industry, you need money to protect yourself so that you can say no to situations, so that maybe you need to leave a toxic boss, or even if you want to take on a new opportunity. Maybe your emergency fund can be less than that 9 months to 12 months that an entrepreneur has to keep, because typically in this industry, it's easier to find employment. But so there's subtle nuances in the specifics of managing your money, but by and large, they're all entrepreneurs.
If only there was somebody who understood the subtle differences in managing their money and could provide them with simple tools that they could apply to their life to help them get where they wanted to go. Barbara, what are the types of tools? Like, what are some of the things that you do, like at a very like bullet point level of how do you help your clients so that they don't have to become you in order to find success?
Yeah, so we replicate basic employer provided benefits, right? So you don't have PTO, we're going to set up PTO. How are we going to do that? We are going to look for trends for where there's like big influxes of cash. Let's say you're an industry professional and the holiday season's coming around, right? You know, November, December, you're going to be pulling an extra grand. Let's use that $1,000 of excess income and bucket for our PTO for the next year. Let's take 10 envelopes, let's break digital envelopes, however you want to bucket it, put $100 earmark it for 10 days off that you can take next year, right? So we're just going to start to replicate those systems and understand that some of this is just mental shifts, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to investing, I always like to say investing is like wine. You can get, and my investing chapter is so good because if you understand what it's like to be at the bar, you're going to understand how to invest by the end of this chapter. So investing is like wine in that you can get really into the weeds, right? You can talk about Forex, you can talk about crypto, you can talk about bell curves and PE ratios. You can get so into the weeds with investing, but you don't have to get that into the weeds in order to have a great investing career. And the same is true for wine, right? You can get very into the weeds with wine. You know, the tannins and the year and the body and the notes and the mouthfeel and oh my, the region. And you can talk about wine, but you don't have to get that deep into wine to have a great wine experience. A little bit about your tolerance, a little bit about what you like, and you can have a great experience. And so, yeah, I think simplicity is key here. Financial services does a disservice to a lot of the public by overcomplicating a lot of these concepts with jargon, and it's their way of gatekeeping. And, you know, I think it's important to remind people that a lot of these concepts can be broken down very simply if somebody wants to break them down simply.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's beautiful. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, are you a wine gal?
I worked in bars for 20 years. I'm an everything gal.
You gotta check out Drops of God. My wife and I just watched Drops of God, which is like, it's a love letter to just wine, and it's all in French and Japanese. It's beautiful. It's on Amazon. You got to check it out. It's like an 8-part miniseries, but it's just exactly what you're talking about. Like one of the people is like a very like simple approach to like really understand. It was very interesting. Sort of a digression, but I thought it was worthwhile.
No, I love it. That's awesome.
So when it's all said and done, Barbara, what is the legacy that you want to leave? Is it to help the folks that you help in like this transactional one-off and maybe community way, or is it to change legislation or change the system? Like what is the legacy that you want to leave behind on this particular sector? Because if you've been listening, Barbara's got a few different sectors that she's going to leave a legacy behind on.
Yeah. So in the other career that I'm in, which is construction, there's an organization called OSHA. And when OSHA came around, what their goal was to reduce workplace injuries and death, right? And so they trained the workers on how to navigate work within the hazards that were in their sector. That is what I want to do in this industry. When you educate the workforce, you can change the industry from within. And that's what I want to do is educate this workforce and help them help themselves change the industry from within. Because these are educated, smart, talented professionals that often there's this moral or ambition failure perception that's put upon them by society, right? There's like, oh, this illegitimacy that's tied to these roles in this profession, whether it's Hollywood doing the classic trope of the struggling waitress or the stripper who, you know, isn't going to become an actress or whatever it is, right? There's this undertone of not taking these people seriously when really they're highly skilled. And they're valuable members of our society that have a lot that they can do if they were just boosted up and given a little more hope and education.
Well, I love this bottom up approach, and I'm sure that we're going to see quite a legacy when it's all said and done from you, Barbara. Barbara, there's 2 questions that I ask every single guest that comes on the show. Are you ready for those 2 questions now?
Let's do it.
All right. Yeah. So question number 1, if you had access to unlimited financial resources, how would you profitably grow? And I'll give you a little space here, but let me just get it out. How would you profitably grow this business? And then I would also say profitably could be interchanged with like changing laws and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would definitely have a legislative
Yeah.
arm to the business that is
Yeah.
pushing more lobbyists towards, getting more resources for training for these people, for the employers to help the employers out more. Because I think when you help the employers, they really want to help the employees too.
Mhm.
So maybe an education arm for the employees as well. And then more coaches to
Yeah.
just, get the message out more so.
That's great. And the second question is, if you had to give up all of the businesses that you're currently or previously have been involved in and start something totally new that you've never done before, what do you think that might be?
Well, that is such a fun question.
Yeah.
I think I guess I would try to be like a purveyor, right? Like I've never owned a bar or a restaurant
Yeah.
or anything like that. And I think, I've spent a lot of time within that industry. And that's one thing I've never, I've had my entrepreneur hat on for a long time and
Mhm.
I've never tried to run one of those businesses. And I think that would be a huge challenge that I would be ready for.
How does Barbara's Bar set up its payment?
That's interesting. Oh, it'd have to have a theme. So I'm thinking of like some sort of I wrote a self-help book for people. So maybe some sort of self-help theme bar where
Yeah.
there's like a shake weight and like videos of like 80s aerobics and like all
Yeah.
the drinks are named after like self-help books. And how do we take payments? Cash, baby.
Oh, no, what I meant is, how would you pay your staff? Like, would you do anything
Oh,
differently if you owned the restaurant? That was a great answer. That's why I didn't stop you. But like, it's a great answer. But also, like, what would you do if you were the purveyor, right? Like, so what would you do for your people, just to flesh it out? Yeah.
yeah, if I had unlimited resources, yeah, it'd be a 401k with a
Yeah.
10% match and a big paid time off policy. Because I think one of the other problems in this industry is when you don't have paid time off, you aren't, there's burnout in this
Yeah.
industry like no other industry. And so if these people actually took time off, like the average American gets 20 days paid off. That's like a working month. Can
Hmm.
you imagine being in an industry where not even one day is the standard? So I would be giving so much time off. I would be promoting more wellness. This is not an area that this industry has a lot of overlap in. So like encouraging more drinking water,
Yeah.
going to the bathroom. When you think about people who are serving other people, they put other
Yeah.
people before themselves so much. So yeah, I just think of there's a lot of resources that
Well,
you
I'll
could
keep
give
my
them.
eyes out for Barbara's Bars to be popping up in all the metropolitan areas in 50 states coming up. There's just no question that if you've been even paying any attention, you're blown away by Barbara, her mission, how deeply she understands her niche, and how much she cares about making a change on it and the world. And so if people are still listening, it's not for me, it's from you, Barbara. So how can they find you?
Yeah, the book's available on Amazon. They can type in tipped book, Tip, the life-changing guide to financial freedom for waitresses, bartenders, strippers, and all other service industry professionals. You can connect with me on all the socials at Tipped Finance. I hang out mostly on Instagram where I make memes or I post videos of stand-up that I do. I try to make personal finance pretty fun and approachable. If you want to connect with me, you can also find me on my website, tippedfinance.com. We can do one-on-one coaching. I can come to your establishment and give a worker talk. If you're an industry professional and you have a win, please tell me. I love to celebrate
Yeah.
these professionals. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Barbara, you've over delivered today. This has been a fantastic conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, Barbara Sloan, thank you so much for your time.
Jason, this was so much fun. Thank you.